Danielle, I want to welcome you to these SAPIR seminars, if you will. We've been doing them now for over 3 years, I think, very successfully, trying to amplify the voices that we seek to publish in SAPIR. And you have what I think, to my mind, is a genuine landmark essay in our latest issue on friends and foes, which people can find by going to sapirjournal.org. We also will have published copies quite soon. And it's an essay that is particularly important right now because the arbiters of fact, human rights groups, including Human Rights Watch, for which you worked for many years, are taking to the minds of many a very one-sided view and prejudicial view and invidious view of the conflict now between Israel and Hamas. So you have written this essay based on many years as an insider at Human Rights Watch, which says a lot of things that I think many people suspected but didn't know in such granular and upsetting detail. I will just say to those of you who are participating on this call, the way these conversations work is that Danielle and I will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll reserve the last 20 minutes of our hour for questions from audience members, from participants. So there is a chat function or a Q&A function. I look at them both at the bottom of your Zoom screens. And as questions occur to you, please put them in the Q&A or chat functions, and I will try to ask as many questions as I can. We have time for. So just bear that in mind as this conversation takes place. I'll do my best to get to as many audience questions as possible. Danielle, just because I think it's worth giving our audience a sense of who you are. Tell us a little bit about where you're from and the arc of your career till now.
Well, I was born in South Africa. My family moved to England. So I went to school and university in England, undergrad, and then came to Israel for 8 years-ish, where I was in journalism, primarily at Reuters. And I was the Israel correspondent for the San Francisco Chronicle when there was such a thing. Mm-hmm. And then I went to Columbia. I was in academia and doing a PhD program for a few years, and then went straight to Human Rights Watch. It was the first job I got when I could have an American visa, when I became a citizen, actually. So
you started working for Human Rights Watch in New York?
Yeah, I was there for 5-6 years and then came here.
And what is it about the work that appealed to your thinking or your sensibilities?
Well, as I said, since I've been in journalism, there was a whole side of Human Rights Watch work that seemed very copacetic with that. So, voice to the victims and in the field research and all that stuff. And then having had this period in academia, it was also quite a heavyweight organization. It did deep research. There was an emphasis on quality and all the rest of that. So those two factors, and also the fact it was an international organization, given my own background, which was somewhat peripatetic, it just felt like the right kind of mesh on all three fronts.
Now, for many years, I think 13 years, you were the lead editor of the Human Rights HRW's World Report, and you begin by noting in your essay that a report that covers at least 100 countries, if not more, seemed to devote considerable outsized attention to the Israel Palestine chapter. Did you ever get a satisfying explanation as to why the Israel Palestine chapter would get as much attention as, say, attention to human rights abuses in China, Russia, Syria, Iran, and so on?
No, that's the bottom line. I did not. And, in general, there are only so many times you can raise things until you sound nuts. So I would try and space out the questioning over time when things did not change or there was no further answer. I'd raise it again in an attempt to genuinely understand it and genuinely communicate this to readers. The World Report was a very strange product in many ways. It was written, each chapter was written by a different author in different divisions, and it was kind of put together at the end, which meant there were enormous inconsistencies in how things were weighted and language. And partly I was able to iron that out, although I saw it at the very end, and partly those inconsistencies simply remained. And I thought it was so overt, the difference in the weight of the chapter, and there was no equivalent situation. Even countries that we bundled together, like Bosnia-Herzegovina or Kosovo, whatever, there was no logical explanation I could see. And so I genuinely sought it, and I never got an answer. And I felt like the last round, which was last year, I felt a resistance to actually committing anything to paper, to be honest. I was asking by email, I was asking in person, and I got the strong sense they simply didn't want to write anything down and create any sort of record of a response, was my interpretation.
Human Rights Watch was founded in the 1970s by Robert Bernstein, who later denounced the organization in a famous op-ed in the New York Times for the turn, in large part for the turn it had taken against Israel. Do you have any sense of the dynamics, not just in Human Rights Watch, but in what you might call the human rights community in general, which led to that transformation from a focus on politically repressive regimes like, Poland under the communist in the communist period, or other totalitarian states, to the obsession with the faults of democratic states, and in particular of Israel?
Well, I can only talk about what I saw during my span, and there was a definite shift that occurred. I think it came about with specific people. People can have enormous influence within organizations, and there have definitely been some outsized characters within Human Rights Watch who are just known. You just have to kind of Google that. So that happened. At the same time, there was a lot of generational change. The old guard, as far as I could see, was aging out. It was getting older, nearing retirement, and there was a new vanguard coming in that was culturally, ethnically, educationally very different. Not afraid to reduce things to hashtags, used to tweeting, and not burdened by complexity. And when I raised these issues, or raised issues with older guard people, let's say, they would say more than a few, well, it's the way it's going. What can I really do? And to be honest, many articulated their eye on the prize of retirement. And I think it's sort of into this kind of not knowing what to do and feeling this absolute tide coming forward of a new generation. That's part of it, for sure. So
walk us through.
Yeah.
I want to ask about specifics, and we're going to get to October 7th in a moment, but walk us through the mechanics by which the Israel Palestine chapter would get written. Was it multiple authors? Was it one author? Did the identity, the ethnic or religious identity of the authors matter? How did they come? How were they produced?
Well, the way chapters were generally decided was, as the editor, you'd send the overall word count for the Middle East and North Africa division, for example, to them, and they would divvy up how many words the Israel Palestine chapter was going to get, the Tunisia chapter, the Algeria chapter, whatever. And beyond that point, they sort of decided who the author was and how they were going to construct that chapter and what weight and priority they were going to give different issues. So that's partly where all the variation came in with the different chapters. So one country might prioritize education and one might prioritize something else. And that was sort of, we left it to their discretion based on what was going on. It went through a lot of editing. but not by me. So it was a whole system. It would go, there was an edit, there was an author, it would get edited within division, it would go out to legal, it would come to the central division in which I was programmed, it would go back for another round of exactly the same. And at the very, very end, it would come to me. Every single chapter would come to me. The Israel Palestine chapter was the only chapter, to my knowledge, that went to the head of the organization, Ken Roth, for review all those years, due to its delicacy, I assume, but that already stood out. And then I would look at it. I would say that it was the chapter I left till the very end, because it was the most tortuous chapter for me to edit, because it was the source of more pushback and thinly veiled vitriol than any other chapter that was totally unlike anything else. So during the last round, having caught several factual errors, which should have been caught several times by several different people, there was a very tense exchange that happened in front of various people by email, in which the author effectively said, why is she looking at this chapter? He used the word whitewashing. She's trying to whitewash Israeli crimes. And then it resulted in me saying, how is he allowed to say this? This is hardly collegial. And there was a kind of sort of slight slap on the wrist that didn't equate to the conversation I'd had with this manager, because that was the way it went. People would articulate things behind the scenes, and then when it came to actually managing a situation, it was considered, it was tamped down, and it was kind of, I felt, often reduced to an interpersonal issue, or the Middle East, that Israel Palestine thing is sure raises a lot of hackles, or sure creates tension. And I felt that was totally unacceptable, that a very normal practice of editing should be basically reduced to something that it wasn't, other than poor collegial behavior. So that's the story of that chapter.
There is a tendency in various academic institutions, and I suspect also at human rights organizations, that chapters that are about, say, ethnically or culturally specific areas will have authors who are not just familiar with, but also often members of that ethnicity or culture or religion. You note in your essay that you were, to your knowledge, the only Israeli who had any hand in the creation of the Israel chapter. Is that of the Israel Palestine chapter? Is that correct?
There was another Israeli. She lives in Ramallah. So the only one here, the only one who lives here, and she was involved, but fairly new over the past couple of years.
Now,
go ahead. No.
On October 7th, you quote this. The first response to the massacre from Human Rights Watch said, quote, Palestinian armed groups carried out a deadly assault on October 7th, 2023 that killed several hundred Israeli civilians and led to Israeli counterstrikes that killed hundreds of Palestinians. As you say, the word you use is clinical. How did that statement differ from, say, statements about, say, the bombing of Aleppo by Russian forces, or other major human rights events in the last decade or so?
Well, obviously it was different. And I think I don't even have to say what the conversation was like behind the scenes. You can see it represented differently in the published material that Human Rights Watch puts out all the time about all sorts of issues. I mean, it was simply, and in meetings that subsequently happened post October the 7th, organization-wide meetings, it was just a horrifying absence of any outrage. I mean, there was a meeting on October 23rd dedicated to Israel Palestine, in which Israeli victims were not mentioned at all. There was not a mention of a hostage. There was not a mention of anyone killed on October the 7th, but there was time given to the Gaza researcher to talk about her experience. And, there was reference to a Thai foreign worker who had been interviewed. And I think this is quite important. I think people are often looking for, notes of outrage, or was this said in a different way to that? And I think what's so important to understand about what's going on in these human rights organizations, it's not the same as what's going on campuses. It is not loud, and it is not slogany, and it is the antithesis. It's quiet. It's the absence of presence. It's the absence of Jews or Israelis being at the table or being mentioned in the conversation. It is the lacuna. It's simply they're not there. And so I think that's as much part of the equation as saying, well, are Jews expressed with disdain? The whole Israel is generally expressed with disdain. I never heard anything other particularly. And the silence is the thing that ultimately I found quite devastating overall.
You mentioned somewhere in your essay that in many respects you were personally sympathetic to the criticisms that Human Rights Watch had about Israeli policy. So without any invidious inferences, I'm going to imagine that you're not, say, a person of the Israeli right. But you are clearly making a distinction between what you see as a world of legitimate criticism of Israeli policy with the way in which Human Rights Watch criticized Israeli policy. And could you help us sort of understand that distinction between where you stood in terms of your view of Israel's policies and the way in which Human Rights Watch in general approached the same question?
I came to Human Rights Watch, and I remain a person who is open to criticism about Israel. I mean, I am no naive, rose-colored glasses person here. And so it was within that spirit, and I think it's within that spirit that a lot of the liberal, left-leaning Jews at Human Rights Watch, and also non-Jews, sort of took the criticism initially and examined one's own biases and so on. And I think into that breach of really examining oneself came again a sort of a wave of people who were not burdened by subtlety at all. And I think there are certain moments that I think you can chart things really shifted, not only the arrival of certain people, but the apartheid report getting written, which I think was a really damaging step, not because of the policy taken. Like, all organizations can take policies all the time, but if you're going to take a policy, make sure that it's applied evenly, and make sure that everything you've just said vis-a-vis Israel has been checked against other countries. Did you examine other countries in which the apartheid label could be applied? If not, why not? If Israel is this colonizer occupied, did you examine other instances, maybe Australia, maybe Canada, maybe the United States of America? If not, why not? And so there began to be this kind of separation off of Israel and the application of this one term. And I found it to be increasingly intellectually dishonest, so that it was a very contentious thing within the organization. It wasn't that it just passed and it became the norm, but having been established as the policy of the organization, the thing was, well, we wrote a long report on this, and all the different subtleties of the legal argument are there in the report. Well, that's nice, but no one's going to read the report at all, and no one subsequently has. And it's simply been reduced over the years, quite consciously, I think, by those within the organization, to hashtag apartheid. So it doesn't really matter what they're sort of covering themselves by saying, well, all the subtleties are in the report. But when you put hashtag apartheid and put it on Israel's name every single time you're going to do a tweet, I think it's incredibly insidious. And
Human Rights Watch might respond that over the years, from time to time, they have published reports detailing Palestinian human rights abuses by the Palestinian Authority in one case, in another case by Hamas in Gaza. But I'd like to get your sense of how the balance of criticism lies. I mean, one of the things that you point out in your piece, which I found so interesting, is just how incredibly incurious the HRW seem to be about, for instance, the presence of Hamas fighters, terrorists in Al-Shifa hospital, or the way in which they had taken civilian infrastructure and turned it into military purposes, or their use of UNRWA as a shield, or even sometimes a vehicle for their activities. So, what would you say to a Human Rights Watch viewer, on this call, saying, "Well, we've actually been perfectly even-handed. We also criticize the Palestinians."
Well, maybe, but not to the extent it requires. If you're going to be an even player in this, so sure, some work got produced. All as I could say, and I was not in the Middle East division, which is what I assume they would also say. But I would say I was plenty party to the expression of things outside the division in public forums, and it in no way was covered in the same way, in the same depth. It wasn't even a source of outrage. I mean, I was on the Israel Palestine listserv, which I joined in all innocence, thinking this was going to be some sort of forum for debate, and there was virtually nothing ever about Palestinians. So again, it forces people to sound like they're on some sort of platform that they're not. I'm not interested in whitewashing Israel at all, but there is no way, shape, or form that the sympathies of those people most tasked with Israel Palestine work, and you just have to look up their backgrounds, lies in any way with true investigation of an equal investigation of both sides.
One of the things that I found very striking about your essay is the extent to which some members of Human Rights Watch would resort to exchanging notes with one another in encoded apps like Signal or WhatsApp or whatever. I mean, I know this seems like a stupid question, but just tell us why they would be doing that.
Because no one, first of all, there was there was shock. There was shock at what had been said over time. And people, was it the sense that anyone could actually follow anyone else? I don't even know. It was a sense that the environment was so incredibly hostile at this point, and that there had been so much gaslighting, and that any criticism was likely to be misconstrued as you, and that's how they kept criticism at bay. And that in general, that's how they keep criticism at bay, by saying, well, she must be a fill in the blank Zionist, Bibi sympathizer. Not that they ever articulated this, but if the benchmark is genocide and apartheid, then you can only be not a sufficient devotee to their cause, quite honestly. And I personally was not willing to flag anything publicly about my feelings, and I think people felt enormous pressure and conflict as professionals. They expressed enormous inner torture about having arrived at an institution they'd worked so hard to get to, and then you also saw the machinations and the way they eventually landed, which was to say, well, it's better I'm here than not at all, and maybe I can change something within. And then they retreated again, because it is simply too overwhelming to go up against these institutions, I think most people feel, and they've seen how other people are treated. And I think the way Robert Bernstein was casually referred to, possibly the way I'm now referred to or ignored, or the way I was certainly kind of booted out, very, very, very carefully, very, very clearly, hardly inspires people to speak up. No matter the veneer that is now present within the organizations of a lot of listening channels and coffee hours, and there are all these channels. If the same channels end up at the same dead end, people also know not to try.
So let me ask you in that connection. In the years that you remained at HRW, what was your thinking? I mean, clearly this was building over a number of years. Like, how did you think about your role there? I mean, you just mentioned that a lot of people felt like I'm doing more good than harm, or I'm preventing harms from being done. It would be much worse if I weren't here. Walk us through your thinking before you finally decided to leave?
Why I stayed, kind of why.
Why you stayed? Yeah.
Well, I think it's hard to leave a job. I mean,
Yeah.
let's begin there. And I think people who simply say, well, why don't people leave if it's so? Because you're supporting a family, and you're also thinking, well, I'm not doing anything wrong. Why should I be the one to leave? I think personally, I think there are probably some cultural and generational issues. Like, I didn't come into employment at a time when anyone thought they had the right to complain about anything. This was pre-Me Too. I many times saw the sunrise over Jerusalem, having walked into the office at 3 p.m. and it was 7 a.m. by the time I left because there had been a suicide bombing. It didn't cross my mind to ask what my rights are or if I was a trade union. My tolerance level was pretty high for pain in an organization. I think that's also part of it. And I think, these things happen over time. It's a bit like being a frog in boiling water. You simply don't realize, or the temperature, you get acculturated to the temperature rising over time. And I was also isolated, very isolated here, and in terms of the what I felt I was going through. And so why, I think that the sort of natural extension of your question is, why then say something? I think partly because I was aware that other people had experienced the same. And that was enormously powerful to me, to hear exactly the same issues, the same concerns with the same people being articulated. And it was very liberating. And I also think that I want to be sure when I say something. And I had gone through this process of self-checking almost. Human rights organizations have this methodology. When you're proving or you're claiming a human rights abuse, you want to establish a pattern. So you say, what elevates this beyond a single problem to something we can say is a human rights abuse? And you form patterns of saying, well, did it happen here? Did other people say it? And so I have my own sort of process of forming a pattern, which essentially amounted to, has this been happening over time? Have I raised this with enough people? Do enough people know about this? Is this different to what I'm hearing and seeing in other places? Is this getting worse? And the final piece of the puzzle was, and do other people feel the same? And I think once that piece fell into place, I was like, and hearing how they couldn't bring themselves to say anything, I was like, all right, I will.
Let me ask you, when I mean, at least years ago, when it came to abuses in places like North Korea or China, I would cite Human Rights Watch reports as sources of authority in some of my own writing. Do you think that HRW's reporting on Israel and the Palestinians is of a piece or distinct from the quality of their reporting elsewhere in the world? Which is to say, if they are being heavily one-sided and not at all fact-based when it comes to what's happening now in Gaza, then should we trust any of their any of its output, or do you think that the Israel-Palestinian story is distinct?
I want to say I don't think everything. It's not that it's riddled with inaccuracies at all. And there are so many people who do good work in these organizations, and it is a shame that the work is corrupted, and that's why it's so important that the Israel-Palestine work be dealt with, because it does cast a pall on everything else that you just pointed out. I don't know. I would just say I raised the same question when I edited the World Report. I said to more than one person, given the various problems I see with this chapter, not to do with the line they're taking, but the inaccuracies, the sort of the inaccuracies by omission, things like this, I couldn't vouch for 100%. Any other chapter, and that's not because I don't want to get into the specificity of the Israel-Palestine work so much as to say it betrays problems in process, that it goes across the organization. If there is not enough editing, if there are not enough checks and balances, You know, those are the things that could be true of other work. I don't know, and it's hard for me, and it's sad for me to say, because I know other good work goes on. But if you tolerate something so exceptional in one area, then this is the natural consequence. Everything gets pulled into question, I think.
And you mentioned on a few occasions the essay in passing Amnesty International, which seems riddled with many of the same problems as Human Rights Watch. Is there anyone out there doing good human rights work as you see it organizationally, or is the corruption sort of systemic across the entire field?
Lots of people are doing good work. It would be awful to these are huge organizations filled with incredibly smart, dynamic people. But so I would never say that they're not doing good work. I would say they are succumbing to ideology in certain quarters that is incredibly toxic throughout. And it doesn't speak well of senior management if they will turn a blind eye to one corner of the world. So I do, but good work is being done. But the problems that bedevil the human rights industry are across the board, and they are the lack of transparency and accountability. And until those problems are fixed, I don't think these immense behemoths of organizations can really claim to any moral superiority or indeed any particular right to do their work. So again, definitely good work being done, but not with the correct foundation having been laid in place. And the current situation is that largely the organizations are self-regulating and have, to some extent, in some quarters, signed on to various commitments and principles, which sound great. But the risk is that it becomes a bit of a Potemkin village, you know, the construction of these great facades, and who in fact is following whether these principles are being enacted or that their various mechanisms are being carried out. And in fact, as the organization, and I think this is true of others, became more corporatized, and that's definitely happened over time, it's kind of lost this old men around a table, you know, with the Soviet Union on the wall feel that I got the sense that it used to be. And it's becoming corporate, you know, it's charts, it's deliverables, it's language like that. You know, it's lost a certain sort of it's become process, and then I feel it's become more of a mask, quite honestly, because in saying, well, we've got new processes, they again push real accountability at bay.
You so you're raising questions that are particularly important, which is, and this is on the prescriptive end. So we have these very large organizations that issue reports that profoundly shape public understanding and public debate. They are 501c3 tax-exempt organizations. What should we do? What should we do about this? I mean, they clearly, the self-policing functions that they claim to have established are failing. I mean, what's the best way to approach Human Rights Watch to make sure that it actually is committed to what it's supposed to be doing? Because increasingly it seems like a political organization, not a non-governmental one.
That's all. That's such a small question.
What is to be done, says Vladimir Lenin.
So, I mean, this exists as a whole discipline in academia, where they talk about accountability of NGOs, and they talk primarily in terms of upward accountability to donors, which is considered to be the most robust form of accountability that organizations like NGOs partake in. And then there's this kind of lateral accountability internally, which isn't so great. And there's downward, unfortunately, called downward accountability to the people whose communities they're working in, which also is considered not to be that developed. And I think all of those strains need to be worked on. I don't think human rights organizations should be the ones to make sure it happens. And they should not want to be the ones. If they're following through on their own methodology and their own recommendations in which they constantly call for others to be subject to this and that scrutiny, I cannot for the life of me understand where they would not be exemplars of their own methodology and want that thoroughness themselves. So assuming they're on board with that, otherwise I can't see why they would recommend it for others, that shouldn't be too much of a problem. I do think a huge part of this now lies with the outside community, donors, to make sure that they are asking the right questions, and the public to treat this, the products of human rights organizations, as any other product, which means you should ask, is it fact-checked? How much has it been has it all been fact-checked? Are the arguments you're making, are they applied to any other areas? If not, why not? And I think interrogating the absence of explanation, it is not good enough to let organizations get away with the kind of answer they gave in response to the initial email I sent to the organization, which was something like, Human Rights Watch stands by its work and applies the same rigor to Israel Palestine work as it does any other. I hope not, is all I can say. And what does that even mean? And so I think that the nature of the news cycle and the nature of people is to accept what is being said, and there's very little follow-up, and we move on to the next scandal or eruption, of which there have been many in recent years. Between 2019, 18, and 2022, I mean, there was an Amnesty researcher committed suicide, citing the culture of the organization. 1,000 staff of Médecins Sans Frontières signed an internal statement accusing it of racism. Oxfam has been bedeviled by problems. Amnesty researchers have accused it of racism. And where does it all go? It just disappears again. So I think it's really incredibly important that there's follow through by people and the community at large. And they're simply not letting this go unaddressed any longer.
One of the companion essays in this issue is about the BBC from Tom Gross, and I'm struck by the extent to which the organizations you describe remind me of the BBC, which was George Orwell's model, having worked there in the 1940s for the Ministry of Truth in 1984. I'm gonna turn now to our audience. There are a lot of questions on the board, and we have Doug from London. He says, HRW is a very trusted source and often used as the single source in coverage of the international broadcaster I worked for. A disproportionate area of our coverage was Israel Palestine, and our internal bias was definitely anti-Israel and not interested in internal Palestinian affairs. If you wanted to be quoted and given quotes, you had to match what we wanted. So did HRW modify its methods for its customers?
I don't know in general. I will say I found a comment quite interesting. In the same exchange I had with this one senior manager on October 7th after the initial reaction, and I was like, why is there no statement? And he said, I thought the initial statement was fine. She criticized, I want to get the words right, she condemned the killings while appealing to a wider audience, including Palestinians. And I said, why does she have to appeal to anyone? Either you're condemning a human rights abuse or you're not. And this struck me as really troubling. It struck me as a note of, what is it, like public consumption to make sure that you're being consumed in the right way by the right audience. So that's what I would respond to that. I can't speak of what they do behind the scenes or who's funding them or anything else.
Let's see. Okay. Eric Cantor wants to know, how much of what you describe is the ultimate responsibility of Kenneth Roth, who appears to have a unique personal disdain for Israel and Zionism?
Listen, I don't think it's helpful to talk about individuals. I think individuals come and go. He's gone, others have come. And I think the problem and the responsibility lies with an organization that does not rein in ideologues who should be engaging in human rights work instead of pushing ideology. So I know people are very fixated on individuals, especially Ken Roth, but I find it unhelpful, actually. I think it serves, it actually plays into their hands slightly by taking away the attention from where it needs to be, which is the organization as a whole.
Sher Oz has a long question. She says she was engrossed by your article, but one sentence was jarring, disturbing the flow of the article, and seemed unrelated to the theme. I am curious about why you felt it necessary to write, quote, focusing on the warped thinking and practice, never mind the deafening silence of many NGOs on Hamas's wanton savagery of October 7th does not abnegate Palestinian suffering or Israeli abuses, end quote. Then she writes, coupling Palestinian suffering with Israeli abuses has become cliche. So my question is, why is it that one cannot write anything positive about Israel without reminding readers that we also know that Israel is not perfect, or that one cannot criticize Hamas or the Palestinian leadership without balancing it out with criticism of Israel, the yes, but phenomenon? Do you have an answer for Sherry?
Because I thought it's what I think. I mean, I feel I wrote a very long article that was explaining a certain position. I didn't feel the need to put it in. I do feel there's a need to criticize Israel. And one of the great tragedies of what's happened within human rights organizations with their Israel work is that because they are so compromised, they have removed themselves, as far as I'm concerned, as being credible players in an incredibly important world, which is to criticize both sides. So sorry if it sounded like it was just a pro forma line, but I maintain that it's very important to keep an eye on Israel at all times.
Gerald Steinberg notes HRW, like other NGOs, has a board of directors, which ostensibly is responsible for oversight over the organization, key officials, and their activities. Did you have any contact with board members?
No, but I did write to them, and they never responded.
Mm-hmm. Ken Auerbach wants to know, does HRW use on-scene investigators to determine the facts upon which reports are based?
On-scene investigators?
On-scene.
Oh, on-scene investigators. Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, there are researchers in the field who provide the first-hand material. But absolutely, and many of them, most of them are great. The problem comes with the fact, like I also noted, that first-hand long-form reports are very much in decline. When I first joined the organization, one of the reasons I was hired was to deal with the number of long-form reports. By the end, I was barely seeing any. So that means that a lot of the work is now opinion and sort of other kinds of products beyond the actual on-the-ground research.
Eric Lipman asks, are you suggesting outside auditing of human rights organizations?
Sure.
Like what?
Like, I don't have the mechanism, and if anyone else does, but it never has really been true that organizations left to their own devices become more moral, more efficient, and more credible. It's simply not the way things work. And I would think that any organization that really wanted to maintain its standards would be fully aware that outside scrutiny is in its own best interests.
Jeffrey Herf, one of our contributors and a historian, distinguished historian, asks, isn't the absence of accountability in human rights, quote unquote, human rights organizations inherent in the fact that they are unelected entities and thus accountable to no one? Why should anyone pay attention to anything they say or write?
Well, like I said, because there is a lot of great work that goes on, but until this accountability issue is dealt with, and it is in no way a new one, it is simply hiding in plain sight, then I think, it's always going to raise questions. And this is a phenomenon that I've been thinking about, how sometimes the biggest characters in popular culture or the biggest institutions are the ones we simply don't pay attention to. They are so large, they are so established that we simply don't pay them attention until we do. And I very much hope that this is the moment for human rights organizations.
Lawrence Haas wants to ask an impolite question, which is whether everything you experienced reflects overt or covert feelings or thoughts of anti-Semitism within HRW. That is, the one-sidedness a reflection of more than just thoughts about Israel as a country and more about a Jewish state filled with Jews?
Well, that Lawrence is not a relative, as far as I know. But this is the million-dollar question, isn't it, with anti-Semitism in Israel? And this is why I think Jews have ceded ground and simply don't want to touch the Israel issue because they are not sure if it's anti-Semitism, and it's so icky and it's all rather complicated. I would say that in an era in which they're falling over themselves backwards at this point to examine their unconscious biases in the wake of Me Too, in the wake of Black Lives Matter, given the sensitivity and the fine line between anti-Semitism and anti-Israel rhetoric, I would hope they would be extremely careful about the line and not crossing it, and would certainly do workshops in the organization, or perhaps know where their researcher on anti-Semitism was. He appeared to be lost after October the 7th, and no one quite knew where he was. So I think that would be great.
Karen De Podesta asks, she thanks you for the powerful article and insights, but especially now that the few voices of dissent like yours are gone, is there any hope for representation?
I didn't understand the end.
I think the question is basically with you and perhaps others like you no longer in the organization.
Oh, I see.
Is HRW even more?
Well, I wasn't doing a lot anyway, I have to say, by the end. But I think we run the risk of Jew-free zones, or Jew-free sort of professions. And that will be because either there's a sort of, you don't have to say anything in not hiring people of a certain ethnicity. You can just say the other candidate was better. I don't know what's going on exactly. I do think they would probably want to avoid a situation like me again. So there's that. I think also these are professions that maybe Jews will avoid, much like certain university campuses. And that would be a shame too. I think it's incredibly important that, and this is one of the things when you talk about prescriptive elements, that the Jewish community in particular provide support essentially to people who are speaking out, and connect people and not leave them hanging in the wind. It feels extremely vulnerable to come out knowing there's an organization behind you that is really probably not feeling you at this point. And yet there's a sort of lack of sense as to where to land as well. So I don't think it looks good. There will always be Jews, but I don't feel people are speaking out and will in the near future.
I'm going to ask a question of my own simply because it's connected to the last. But if you were given a great deal of philanthropic money and the title of managing director or whatever it might be, to start a new human rights organization, what would be sort of the foundational core principles of that organization that would keep it honest and, as they used to say, straight?
I think it's important to establish a principle of evenness. So if you are going, like I said, if you're going to adopt a certain policy, I would say, are we making sure, have we investigated the applicability of that policy elsewhere? So that one country does not become the pariah of the world with the label apartheid, occupier, colonizer attached to it above all others, when there are plenty of other candidates for whom this probably applies. I think it's a basic principle of honesty to say, and this what goes to the inaccuracy by omission. They might not be wrong in applying the label to Israel or anywhere else, but they sure aren't doing very thorough intellectual work by simply not paying attention to anywhere else. So I think that's critical. I think there definitely needs to be outside channels of, and this goes to the outside scrutiny and also the NGO confidential platform I just set up as a way for people to reach out within organizations, whether or not it is effective or people use it. It addresses what I think is a crucial need, which is that people don't get trapped inside organizations where they can't say anything. And we being me and others who got together and discussed things had tried the channels that were available to us, and there was simply nothing more that could be done. So those are two. I mean, definitely to make sure that people have a way of communicating, like an ombudsman person or something. That's for starters. I mean,
I once discovered that the same department or the same person who runs fact-checking at the New Yorker also runs corrections. Curiously, I wasn't able to get my correction into the New Yorker, but that's an aside. Ron Levy, who's in Montreal, says his question is not 109% on topic, but Bibi is looking to expel Al Jazeera from Israel. In view of Al Jazeera's obvious bias, would you support that?
Yeah, I don't tend to, I have to say. And then this is the same thing that happened with the Israel Palestine researcher of Human Rights Watch, Omar Shakir, who was deported in 2019 by Israel. I didn't stand by that as a democratic step as much as the work. One could say a lot about him. But I also actually, that was one of the 2 times I was ever included in work in Israel, or I was invited to participate in anything, was when he was deported. And I was invited to go to the press conference at Ben Gurion Airport as he was being booted. And while I didn't support his being deported, and I actually had gone to the Jerusalem court on a day he was before the court, I also don't like being played, as I felt, to be a prop in someone's theater on the way out. So I try and walk a line. I wouldn't support him, Al Jazeera being expelled. This is a democratic country, but yeah.
Well, I'm with you on that for whatever that's worth.
Okay.
Now, Karen Frid wants to know, what do you think is behind the corruption of the people at your organization? What is the agenda behind changing or covering the facts in Israel? And let me add something to that question, which is, to what extent was the problem one of ideology, and to what extent was it one of groupthink, if that's a meaningful distinction?
Well, I think the ideology resulted in the groupthink. I mean, given the vast number of people who don't know the first thing about Israel, the ideology was somewhat overwhelming. And when you're being presented in a very clear and definitive way, and I think there are many people who, in good faith, participate in these organization-wide meetings, and this is their exposure to the issue. And in the absence, as I said, of any other point of view or any subtlety, they are likely to believe it, or that they are likely to be on board with it. So I think one produced the other, and it's become a culture in which one does not speak up, and that is true. And if Human Rights Watch were to say that we have all these channels, again, it would mask the fact that these channels, it is very clear what the temperature in the room is, and people do not want to go there. So
Jesse Scolaro has a question. Given the reach and impact of social media, particularly on younger people, and considering the amount of propaganda that flooded people's social feeds around October 7th and the war in Gaza, how are social media posts vetted at HRW, and did you witness any bias in their social media response?
I'm trying to remember that. I believe they're not edited, the tweets, as far as I can remember. I think the nature of tweets is that they're just, I know there was various despair around various people tweeting when they shouldn't really be tweeting. So it was a bit of a beast that wasn't fully under control, I think, according to the organization. The second part of the question was, sorry, was it, well, sorry.
Yeah. And did you witness any bias in the social response?
Yes. I mean, I just think that the preponderance of focus after October the 7th and since by those who hold portfolios that are to cover both sides simply speaks for itself. It's no great, one only has to go through it to see that it's very little about Palestinians, and it was from the get-go about Israel apartheid and now genocide. And I think it's important to note that when things have been put out or insinuated, there has been no real clarification. Or so about the Al-Ahli hospital, having heavily insinuated for weeks that Israel was behind this attack, when it was eventually proven that it wasn't, largely proven, there was no great fanfare as well. You know, this clearly shows Israel was not to blame.
Yeah. Irina Zuckerman notes the issue of transparency and links to human rights abusive state actors has come up more than once. Particular narratives appear coordinated with other organizations, she notes, and with other parties. Is there a mechanism for exposing the money and communications trail that could discredit such abuses of these organizations? I guess the first question is really one that I'm curious about. Is there coordination with other human rights organizations?
On certain messaging?
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that part of they form the apartheid report was, you know, certainly they've worked together. I don't know how all the research works, but there's definitely partnerships. Absolutely. And that's fair enough. You know, they are working to effect an end. So they are colleagues in the field. That's no secret at all. And they often author reports together, or the ACLU and Human Rights Watch or something like that.
You mentioned just briefly in a previous answer a new platform you called NGO Confidential. Can you tell us a little more about that?
It was, like I said, it's a fairly rudimentary, but I think crucial step in really addressing something that I was burdened with, and I subsequently understood that other people were burdened with, which is that there is no one to turn to. And if there's something wrong, and for many years I thought about going to an employment lawyer, and I in fact did at one point, or I tried different avenues, and it's simply a way of saying, and I would love it not to be limited to Israel work. I think there's a huge need, as we can see with all the complaints about racism within MSF or in other organizations. These places are riddled with staff who have things to say, and clearly, you know, a lot of it's getting out through leaks. So that would be the goal, that people would simply feel there's a place to go in complete confidentiality to rectify the current lack of avenues, despite them being outlined. If they all lead to your fact checker, you know, they're not going anywhere.
I do my best to stick to time, and people are taking an hour from their Mondays to listen in. So I want to just conclude by thanking you again for an article that, as I said at the beginning, is a landmark article, I think, in this field. Could not have been more timely and important and brilliantly written, I might add. And I would add one more thing, which is courageous. You've taken a stand, as you said earlier in our conversation. It's never easy to leave a job or even a career, and I think you've done so in a way that brings great credit to you, and a little bit of credit to us at SAPIR, who are trying to produce, as we say, ideas for a thriving Jewish future. So, Danielle, I want to thank you so much for giving us your time. I want to thank our audience for staying with us. I'm sorry that I didn't get Allison, Mark, I see Gary, a number of other questions that I didn't manage to get to. My apologies. It was just a matter of running out of time. But we will have more of these conversations, and I hope you continue your work, Danielle, because you have done a lot to shed important light in a dark place. So thank you so much. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much.